Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you very much. Great to have everybody with us here today as we are in sunny Atlanta, the place where summer will not leave us, even though technically on the calendar it says it's fall. But Cody Deese, welcome. How are you today, my friend?
I always feel like we're doing a morning radio show.
Today's weather is clear but sunny and hot. There is a heat advisory today. But
it feels like, so for those of you that don't know, we record these generally in the AM.
Yes.
On Wednesdays, actually. And
right.
We alternate with days. But
yeah,
it does still feel sometimes like we're going live on a morning radio show. And I have always said this about you. For those of you that don't know Doug King that well, you understand I love the work that we do, but I actually think you are at your best if you had a morning radio show about Ohio State Buckeyes.
Oh my gosh. Don't get me, because then I'm going to regress into my religion.
But you could talk about Ohio State for days and it not get old to you.
Right. That's, that's just my passion in life. It's kind of a funny thing. I used to be a guy that was anything sports. And over the years, really right now, I guess college football is kind of my thing. So, yeah, love it.
Well, we're not going to talk about Ohio State today. We're going to talk about Romans chapter 9 through 11. This is, for those that are keeping score, part 5. And we've spent the last 3 episodes giving a little bit of context of who Paul is writing to, which there's some scholarly debate about that, but we know there are like 3 different types of people. So what I want to do on this episode is, Doug, let's recap the intro. So all 3 episodes, let's kind of bring a summary to it. And then there are some points that you didn't get to, that we didn't get to on the last episode, that we need to bring out on this one. So this will be kind of a final installment of the introduction, which is going to help us because in the next episode, we're actually going to crack it open and get into Romans chapter 9. Does that sound good?
That is perfect. That sounds perfect.
Well, let's start from the top. Quick summary recap. So for those of you that can't or didn't listen to the first 3, and by some random chance you started at podcast episode 5, let's bring you up to speed. Romans 9 through 11 is the text that we're looking at here. And Paul is writing a letter to what we're saying is 3 different groups of people. So real quickly, I think it's important to remember this book is not for the individual, it's for the collective, which I think is something to bring out, because I grew up in a world where it was about like personal salvation and for the individual. But when you read it, knowing who Paul is writing to and what actually is happening, you begin to see, he's addressing the collective here.
Yes. Whole new world coming.
And the crux of the problem, the 3 individuals that he's writing to, is the believing Gentile, the believing Jew, and of course the non-believing Israel, as it's worded.
Right.
And there's obviously a rift between the 2 groups of people, really the 3 groups of people, and it's over this issue of who's in and who's out.
Yes, it's a 2,000-year-old conundrum that carries on today. Paul's very concern 2,000 years ago is still going on today. And that's why we're taking another look at the narrative, because it's time for us to see if there isn't a bigger picture, a more inclusive picture. And that's why Paul had to write this letter. In Romans 11, 26 and 27, there's more disagreement in the commentaries, the theologians, than you'll find just about on any passage. And there's a reason for that we've talked about. To summarize, it is that Paul makes this statement, and so all Israel shall be saved. And there's the problem. People don't like universalism. And Paul was a universalist. He said all Israel will be saved. He said Jacob will have ungodliness turned away. And Jacob is all 12 tribes, not some of the tribes, not just the southern tribes who remained part of the temple worship. It includes the northern tribes who became later the Samaritans, who were not kosher, who were not following temple practice, who were not part of the priesthood and the sacrificial system and so forth. And yet here Paul is trying to say all Israel will be saved. Why is he writing the letter? Because the Gentiles in Rome don't believe it. The Gentiles in Rome think this is a saved, lost paradigm that Jesus came to bring. Some are going to be saved, some are going to be lost. And if you look at Christianity as a religion, unfortunately, there's a small percentage that will be saved, and the greater part of God's creation is lost. Paul is saying, I don't agree with that, and you Gentiles, if you keep saying this, the next thing you know, you'll set up a Vatican and have a church and institutionalize Jesus. Well, that's why he wrote this letter.
Whoa.
Did I go too far?
You are like a horse in a Kentucky Derby. I literally just pitched one ball and you just jet it.
Well, it's time to think. I mean, I put it out there.
That's strong, man.
I'm putting it out there. I'm ready to, and I'm willing to talk about it.
Honestly, literally 6 minutes, 9 seconds into this, and you just, every person that was listening is probably offended.
Well, I know that some are, but I also know the emails you and I both get and the conversations you and I both have. I had a great evening last night with some folks that came into town who are so excited about this particular conversation, and that is getting beyond a sin and death paradigm that belongs to Mount Sinai, getting beyond a who's going to get tortured and tormented by God through eternity, and why is it that there's only a small percentage of those on the planet that are going to make it otherwise. So it's a conversation a lot of people have interest in.
I've said this, I think, on a second episode or third episode, but I have myself, if I'm honest, a love-hate relationship with the idea of universalism. The part I love is that I'm included. The part I hate is that my enemy is also included.
Yes.
And one of the things that struck me as we're talking through this recap is this morning I got up and went for a run, as I do. And I actually plugged in our podcast from last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I started listening, which I don't do often. Listen to yourself sometimes can be a little strange, but I plugged in the podcast, and I bring that point up because you made a reference to something that somehow I just skipped over last week, and then I thought it's probably good to bring back. But when you run into Romans 9 through 11 and this tension between the believing Gentile and non-believing Israel, I'm quick to join the side of the Gentiles. Like as I read this, I'm quick to be like, A, I'm a Gentile. Mm-hmm. And then B, I'm like and hang with me, all this is in quotes, but sure. I'm like a postmodern progressive, post-Christian, post-evangelical. So of course I'm into the new thing. So of course out with circumcision and dietary laws, out with the old, bring in the new. But you took it even a step further and you made a reference to, it's even beyond that. The unbelieving Israel were literally trying to kill Paul and this message and the inclusion of Gentiles.
Yes. And actually, Paul is living out the Christ experience in that. This whole story started with Jesus of Nazareth going to the cross, and as the Christ, hanging there in his very last moments, he starts the process of saying, Father, forgive them. Forgive who? Forgive the unbelieving, hard-hearted people that are persecuting me, people that have nailed me to a cross. Forgive them. My question, first of all, is, did God answer that prayer? And then secondly, he says, for they know not what they do. Jesus frames the hard-hearted persecutor as someone who is actually not conscious of the innate image in which they were created. It is not a problem of what their image is. It is a problem of how conscious they are of that image. And when we reframe this paradigm, it allows me to look at anybody on this planet and understand that there are going to be some who are completely unconscious of that image. Now, when we get into Romans, we'll see that that does not mean that when you go through life, if you live in resistance to spirit, that there are not going to be results from that and consequences from that. We'll get to that later when we talk a little bit about the purpose of the wrath of God, because it is there. But that purpose is always to purge, to restore, and to reconcile. God's story is one of wholeness, not duality, not incompleteness, but one of wholeness. And that's why Paul is a universalist, because that is the nature of God.
I was also thinking about what Christianity has done to Judaism. And what I mean by that is, for any of our Jewish brothers and sisters that are listening, you would hear something like this and think that's the problem. And it's incredibly offensive in that way that we would just disregard Judaism, the mother that we came from, Christianity at least. And it's interesting to me that if you continue to follow the path of Christianity, inevitably it leads you into a denial of Judaism.
Correct.
But if you follow what Paul is saying here, it's actually in some ways it's the antithesis of that. Like, no. That's part of the problem. Supersessionism, like that is what it's led to. Yeah. But that's a part of the problem, and that's not what Paul is getting at here.
That's you put your finger on it. Many postmodernists will become extremely upset with this discussion of post-Christian thinking, in essence, and say, how in the world can you put down Christianity like that? How can you say you're so superior? Oh, I see. You've just formed a new group. And it's the failure to understand the evolution of the spiritual trajectory from the particular to the universal. You see, once you move into understanding God is universal, you can't take things from God. You can't deny things from God. You can't say there's X amount of the universe or people that don't belong to God. Once you move into the universal, you're not saying, now I've moved into this space and you're not. No. To be universal means, no, I've moved into a space that I think you're in, whether you agree with me or not. I've moved into a space where I'm saying, no, we're all equal. I'm the same as you. I'm not superior to you. I'm the same as you. And I'm the same as every other person on the planet. The question, again, I say over and over, to what degree am I conscious of that today? Before I run and hold others under my judgment or condemn them to hell because they're not in the proper creed, dogma, institution, denomination, etc., have I asked myself, to what degree am I unconscious? And what gives me that right to judge when Jesus said, don't do it? And so, these are the big principles that these two verses are touching upon, and it's why they're so controversial. We are struggling today, 2,000 years later, with the very thing that was Paul's concern.
And that's the paradigm. When I use the idea of supersessionism, here's an interesting word. Supersessionism, you supersede this first religion, or one word would be you have replaced. This is the paradigm, again, of lost and saved.
Yes.
We've replaced, we've superseded, we are now the ones who are in.
Yes.
And they don't have it right. Otherwise, if we believe they did, we would still be in Judaism.
Absolutely. Why didn't Jesus just reform Judaism? If we want to get away from putting people's religion down, why put down Judaism in the first place? Why not have Jesus just come and reform Judaism? You see, people don't have any problem with that. No one ever has any problem with where they currently are. They're there because they think, well, this is the place it was supposed to go, and I'm doing, I represent what it's supposed to be. So, this thinking is what was happening in Rome. You have a group of people that think they're the ones that are saved, and they've determined who's lost. And they've done it on criteria that has to do with self as source?
I want to get into, this is a 2,000-year-old problem, and the paradigm of lost, saved, the paradigm of who's in, who's out, sounds so much like 2019, but we're actually talking about Romans, which is an ancient book. But then the more I thought about it, Doug, the more I thought about group identity, the more I thought about all the way to the beginning of the biblical narrative, the more I thought about, it seems almost like a hopeless problem. I thought about attachment. I thought about labels. I thought about all the ways in which we polarize and divide ourselves because our ego attaches to all of the labels that we've been given. And that's a part of the problem that you see from the very beginning. I mean, you think about Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau, and on down through the narrative it goes to Joseph and his brothers, to the 12 tribes of Israel. My God, they can't even get along all the way through the entire narrative. And then here you have Paul writing years later to this group of people in Rome and just saying, my God, have we not progressed at all? So you Gentiles are included and now you're excluding. And it seems like that is the pattern that you see throughout the narrative. Is Paul helping us break out of that pattern? And just on a personal note, do you have hope that we can break out of that type of vicious cycle?
Yeah, my hope is based on history. And the history that I'm really hopeful about is the history of the narrative, and that egotistically the self, the instinctual self, in the very beginning of the story, which we've talked about in other podcasts quite a bit, you have this desire to divide things and people into good and evil. It starts at the very beginning of the story, good and evil.
Can I pause right here?
Sure.
I'm going to interrupt you. People call that dualistic thinking.
Yes.
And it's interesting because we've been writing, a little wink and a nod here, we've been writing on Genesis 2 and 3. And we've talked about Adam so much, but because I do believe that is the start of you move from a seamless unity, a oneness, to this idea of good and evil. What is that? That's a duality. And so you're introduced to a duality. They take part of engaging or grasping this duality. And it's from that point you see this duality all throughout the biblical narrative. Now,
that's it.
I have a question for you about, by the way, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think you were going somewhere with that point. Now, my question to you about the dualistic thinking, which again is what is present in Rome that Paul is addressing here. Some are in, some are out. Here's how we decide. Hasn't changed at all. We'll get to this soon. But even in the religious world, like, I don't know much about it and frankly don't care, but Calvinism, it's like in Reformed theology, like the idea is like, we'll tell you who's elected, we'll tell you who's not, we'll tell you who's predestined, we'll tell you who's not. It's all the same language. It's the same veneer for who's in, who's out, and we know, and we get to decide. And there are some that are lost, there are some that are saved. And my question is, does it seem to you that this is a problem for the Western world only? And where I'm getting at here is the Eastern world, and we've talked about this before, but the Eastern world seems to not struggle as much with duality. They seem to understand detachment from group identity. They seem to understand detachment from all of these forms. It seems like that is slowly working its way into a post-enlightened Western mindset. Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense, and I would agree with that to a large degree. If you look at what happened, Paul's writing a letter to people in Rome, Gentiles in Rome. After Paul leaves the scene, his big fear is exactly what happens, because you end up with a Vatican, you end up with a Pope, you end up with cardinals and bishops and so on and so forth. And I'm going to say most of the people listening to this podcast are probably not still part of the 1,500 years of Jesus Christ institutionalized as the Roman Catholic Church. That you probably, if you're a listener today still going to a church, most of you, and I'm not saying that I've got a lot of great Catholic friends that I have these discussions with, so I'm not saying that we don't have the Catholic friends just like we have Protestant friends. It's just that that's the trajectory you're bringing up. Whereas in the East, this is what happened in the West. It started in Rome and it went westward. And you have this dualism and this idea of clinging to form, if you will, form of good, form of evil. And now let's get together in our denomination and we'll tell you which form you belong in. Whereas in the East, the discussions have always been more about the oneness of all things and non-duality. Mm-hmm. And that the problem in life, unhappiness and suffering comes from a dualistic mindset. And so my hope is, in answer to your question about hope, my hope is one that is centered in the narrative. And it tells me that things always move from the glorious to the more glorious, that there is movement, there is growth. I call it evolution, that the spirit, the nature of spirit is growth, that the spirit itself has been working since Adam in that garden and continues to work today. And we will go through various times in history where we are becoming conscious and more conscious of what you said, labels and forms and denominations and segregations and discriminations. But, the fact that we're becoming more aware of them is really good, because that's actually a step forward from not recognizing them when they were there. And now we're at a place where, we're saying that they're there and we're saying, well, hashtag me too, and let's put an end to it. Or we're saying justice for all, and let's put an end to that. And so for me, Cody, I'm very hopeful that this is the trajectory of spirit and that the corruptible cannot stand, it never will, and that the incorruptible is always working its way forward.
So I want to get in this before we close, because the point that you're making is that there seems to be an evolution that is taking place that is leading us into this non-dual way of seeing things. That's what Paul is a part of here. Paul is a part of the evolutionary flow here, waving a banner going, I actually said that a couple thousand years ago.
Exactly.
Which, if you think it's radical now, you can imagine why he was so hated.
And for the Protestant who's listening to this, who might be getting upset right now about these radical, ridiculous statements we're making in their minds, what about for 1,500 years that Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican and the Pope? And let's say that you, the listener, were living 500 years ago with Luther, and someone looked at you and you said, well, I'm going a different direction with this thing. And someone looked at you, the listener, and said, who in the world do you think you are to put away 1,500 years? Oh, I see. We've been just fine for 1,500 years. The church has been just fine for 15. Who do you think you are to now come up and say, guess what? Everything you've been doing for 1,500 years is wrong. You see, as a Protestant, you have no problem with that. You say, well, after 1,500 years, we begin to see this and we begin to see that and we begin to see these problems and these problems. After 1,500 years, we did, right? It says the Protestant. So what we're saying is there are always going to be people that say, who in the world are you guys to be talking about something beyond where we are? Well, this is because this is the way it's always been and always will be. There's always the next thing. There's always higher growth, not because of anything of ourselves, meaning my IQ, my intelligence, no, this is the work of spirit, is what we're saying, is that spirit continues to bring higher and higher levels of consciousness. And that's why we're so conscious of all these divisions you mentioned a while ago. And we hadn't been in the past.
And I don't think Paul is trying to reform it. And that's not our message here.
No.
Martin Luther, it's called the Reformation for a reason.
Yeah.
And we think those moments of reforming are necessary, but you reform so many times until you get to the place where you realize maybe it's not about reforming again.
It's time to transcend. It's time to transform. It's time to move forward into that space from whence the deliverer comes in 11, 26, and 27, that space of Zion, which is God's space, God and God alone, Spirit and Spirit alone. And when we're starting to talk about God, we have to ask the question, where is God not? And that brings us to the universal Paul.
So one last point here about Paul's "and all Israel will be saved" to note is that there also seems to be a progression in the book of Romans from chapter 7 to chapter 8. Chapter 7, he speaks of himself as the individual almost who will deliver me from this death. The idea is that he will be saved, but then he moves to chapter 8 and starts talking about creation. So when you talk about all Israel will be saved, when you talk about the concept of the universal, I even think it's more immense and inclusive than even we probably realize. Is that Paul is taking this thing beyond this anthropocentric, humanity to no. When I say all, I mean all, like all creation, humans, the whole thing.
Yes.
Like that is full inclusion.
It's almost like Paul thinks God is all in all. Oh, wait a minute. He did say that. So here we have again, all. Paul is all in Adam, all in Christ. God's all in all. All Israel will be saved. Jacob is all the tribes. This theme is very prevalent. It's just that we haven't really stopped to think about it. We're trying to stop right now in history in this 2019 and whatever years we listen to these going forward and have this conversation. This is the conversation Presence wants to have, is the conversation about moving forward from these past paradigms that are no longer workable, and the reason why so many church buildings and church denominations are losing membership, et cetera, et cetera. It's a problem that Paul put his finger on 2,000 years ago.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left. Any other thoughts? Because next episode, we're going to start this Romans 9, verse 1.
Yeah, I think we've really put our finger pretty much on the fact that any of the deliverance that's coming is, first of all, the individual, as you said in chapter 7, who will deliver me, the individual. Then you have the collective. The creation itself will be delivered, Paul says. And so you have the individual, you have the collective, and the collective is either going to be a Sinai or Zion collective. It's either going to be the first covenant or the second covenant collective. And there's no ends, ands, and betweens. In other words, there's not like some of this and some of that. No, there are two different spheres and you're either in one sphere or the other. And Paul is making it clear that the first sphere is passing away and the end of it is coming. And that when that does, a new heaven and earth, new Jerusalem, a transcendent space will come for all in Adam, all in Christ. And I choose not to glorify and praise Adam anymore for being more powerful than Jesus and saying his all really does mean everybody, but the all in Christ is only, a small percentage of the planet. I'm tired of praising Adam. I'm tired of holding him up and glorifying him. I'm saying it's time to quit denigrating Christ and recognize what Paul did, and that was God was in Christ reconciling the world.
Doug, you
was
have
that
been
too much today?
Fiery today, man.
Yeah, I
you
guess
sound
so.
like a Christian.
I'm a fundamentalist believer in love and universalism.
Oh, man, that is great. That's great.
Well, I think when we get into Romans 9:1, we're going to see that next week that Paul was fired up about it too, and it was on his brain, and it was really, really upsetting him what the Gentiles were saying. And we'll get into that next week when we start Romans 9:1 exegesis.
90 verses in Romans 9 through 11, 38 quotes to the Old Testament.
Wow.
We'll get into that starting next week. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.